Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this James Cooper Creston webinar. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm head of our charities and education team, and I'm joined today by my partner colleague Louise Halsworth. So we're talking about charity financial resilience and collaboration. COVID-19 has been great for our webinars. The number of attendees has shot up dramatically, and I think there's a degree of optimism around this week. Depending on your political persuasion, you may have been pleased by the news from the other side of the Atlantic. We now seem to have a vaccine, and certainly in Hungerford, where I am today, the weather has been quite sunny. Louise has recently returned from an exciting overseas holiday. She reliably informs me that she is based down in Hampshire at the moment, and I think you can tell from the ceiling that you can see in her picture that she probably is in the UK rather than somewhere more glamorous. Hopefully you can see both of us. You should also be able to see the slides in front of you. There is also the option on your screen to submit questions. So if you have any questions, do please submit them. My marketing colleague Lizzie Azza will be collating the questions and dealing with the slides. And we're just to complete the housework, I think we're expecting to be around 30 minutes or so. So if we can move on to the contents of the presentation. So we're looking at financial resilience, we'll look at income generation, we'll look at changing cost structures and good financial management. And then Louise will talk to us about strategic alliances and collaborations and what you should think about when considering a merger. So if we look first at financial resilience generally, I think it's fair to say, and we'll see in a moment what some of the challenges are, that even before COVID-19 came along, there were some quite significant challenges. And then, of course, COVID-19 arrived. I think it's now 8 months ago, presenting some interesting short-term and longer-term challenges, impacts varying depending on the charity that you're in. We're not covering sort of COVID-19 emergency funding in any detail. Those of you that are into webinars will perhaps be interested to know that on our website, there is a webinar on COVID-19 specific measures, which I think dates back to April. It's relevant, the phrase, the new normal. What will the implications be in the future in terms of things like technology, flexibility, travel, working at home, and hopefully also an increased sense of community that has come through over the last few months. And ultimately, for charities, the question is making sure that you're sustainable on a long-term basis and delivering charitable outcomes. So we'll move on to what these pre-existing challenges that I refer to are. I think many would agree that I think reputation is a huge issue for charities. We've seen some high-profile charities that have been severely damaged by reputation, often linked with safeguarding issues with children and vulnerable adults. I think we're seeing more and more regulation. So, for example, in recent months, we've seen a lot more charities receiving visits from the Health and Safety Executive. The Charity Commission are taking great interest. So a lot more regulation generally. We're also seeing technology as a huge issue, which has its pluses and minuses, but moving into sort of more digital age. I think many of us, and those of I think I've reached that sort of age where the speed of change is an increasing challenge. Everything happens very, very rapidly. We've got Brexit and the economic climate in the background. None of that has gone away, and I think it seems that since 2008 and the financial crash, we have been living in an age of austerity, and clearly there will be economic challenges continuing. Trustee skills to deal with these things, really important. Louise will talk about mergers and collaboration and how they may help you in terms of financial resilience a bit later. And of course, there are also some much wider society challenges. So, for example, the most obvious ones perhaps at the moment would be climate change, which I think is here to stay, and equality and diversity and Black Lives Matter. These are all sort of big issues for charities as well as everyone else. So if we move on to some research that the Charities Aid Foundation has done on characteristics of resilient charities, and they listed 6 particular characteristics. So the first is purpose, and knowing what the purpose of your charity is, and more importantly, what it isn't. So the implications of this might be that not just chasing funding that perhaps doesn't sit well with your primary purpose just because it's available. Being aware of what's happening in the wider world, I think, is really important. So political, economic, and things happening in a wider context. So you've got your head up rather than just getting involved in the detail of what your charity does. Effective leadership, as ever, is important. So I think charities that have an effective trustee board and effective staff, and considering strategy, so looking at big picture things, but also the day-to-day effective leadership is really important too. The fourth thing that the Charities Aid Foundation identified is the fact that it is useful to be well networked, perhaps links with awareness, so making sure that you get support and work in partnership with others. The fifth is being financially and operationally fit, and that's something we'll be looking at in a bit more detail today. And one of the key things there is making sure that your income comes from diverse sources. And the sixth and final one was the question of the impact, making sure that you communicate your impact for those that need you. So this is important in terms of communication of impact, both internally within your charity, but also within external stakeholders, and links naturally with the reputation issue that we referred to earlier. I mean, it's worth mentioning finally in this section, considering individual resilience, because all the work that charities do is delivered by individuals. So in an ideal world, all the individuals that working in your charity are resilient to face and cope with whatever challenges face them. So against that background, Lizzie is going to launch our first poll. So the question is, how financially resilient is your charity? So you've got four options there. You think your charity is very resilient, you think it's quite resilient, you think it's not resilient at all, or you don't know. So we'll give you 20 or 30 seconds or so to answer those questions. So we'll give you a few seconds longer if you can sort of get your final votes in. Okay, Lizzie, so if we can launch the results there. So I think we're seeing around, these figures are approximated. So interestingly, that 30% of you are saying that you're very resilient, 60% quite resilient, and only 10% not resilient at all. So I think you're probably in quite a strong position compared to average charities. So that's quite good. So obviously, I think the fact that you're probably aware, you're attending this webinar and aware of resilience is probably a good sign. So if we move on to some more specifics about income generation, I mean, you might say the first word there, maximise, is a bit of a no-brainer, but I think perhaps an important thing there, charities are looking to maximise their income, but I think it's important that charities don't overexpand. I think we have seen a number of charities who've been very successful at income generation, but then perhaps haven't got the organisational structure to catch up. Ideally, you want recurring rather than one-off income. One-off income is good, but it's better to have a recurring income streams. We'll talk a bit more in a moment about diversification. It's worth doing some real work identifying what your key income streams are. I think we do see some charities where perhaps some areas of income have a greater sort of focus in terms of discussion, etc. Although the reality is that the bread and butter income is coming from somewhere else. Looking at commercial and fundraising opportunities, what options are there out there? So many charities, for example, have particular skills. We have seen some charities very successful at providing training offerings commercially. Looking at innovation and particularly around digital and technology solutions, I think it's interesting to know that in terms of trustee skills, I think many charities are chasing trustees who do have skills in these particular areas. And then the final thing in terms of a general comment is looking at scenario planning, so staring over the cliff and saying, well, what would we do if we lost a particular source of income? Often really helpful in terms of planning. So if we can move on to diversification. So a question of minimising risk. And I was speaking with a charity recently whose eggs were very much firmly in one basket, and they were looking at an investment into a new area which helped generate other income. So they were concerned about the risk to the existing charity, but I think the argument might well be that you're already subject to great risk because all your eggs in one basket with one income source. And even though looking to generate a second income source carries with it some risks in terms of the initial investment that's required to generate that income, in the longer run, if that's successful, it will minimise risk. You're fortunate to have investments, looking at the appropriate mix between the investments, whether you invest in stocks and shares, property, whatever it might be, rather than just in one. If you're invested in property, you might want to look at appropriate diversity in terms of a mix between commercial and residential. And maybe it's a good idea also to invest in properties in a different location. We are seeing some charities invest in property funds rather than directly into specific property. buying public sector contracts. So I'm a trustee of an organisation, Oxfordshire Mines. We have public sector contracts we need to tender for every year. Really just making sure that, again, diversification is really useful if you're ever to lose one of those contracts. If you do any commercial opportunities, potentially you might do this through a trading subsidiary. Maximise use of resources might apply, for example, if you have a property, making sure that you rent those properties out. So, for example, it might be a school, or I mentioned previously training, maximising use of your intellectual property, and looking for any government support that's available either at the moment due to COVID-19, so for example the furlough scheme, and any other that might be available. So the two biggest tax supports for charities in recent years have been gift aid and rates relief. In terms of some other observations on diversification, make sure you have a clear plan and fundraising strategy. Be realistic about what you can achieve in the timescales in terms of diversification. If you are diversifying, you might need to sell some properties, and I think we are seeing more charities looking to dispose of properties in recent times. Try and benefit from the general move towards philanthropy and networking. Find out who your friends are and see what benefits that can give in terms of fundraising. You know, appeals at appropriate time work well. We've discussed emergency funding already. Digital, a big stream, potential stream of income into the future. And Louise, in a few moments, will tell us a bit more about how collaboration and mergers can help. So, in terms of cost structures, the first few bullets there are rather negative. You know, you can look at curtailing activities, you can look at restructuring, redundancies, recruitment freeze, you can postpone investments and projects, and these unfortunately are things that many charities have had to do over the last few months. But I think it's important to say that the bigger focus ideally should be on income rather than costs. There's a lot of research that's been done in terms of the psychology of this, is that organisations that focus on reducing costs rather than generating income can often get into a vicious downward spiral. So really, I think you should ideally be looking at focusing on generating income on the top line, albeit that I do appreciate that sometimes cuts do have to be made. There may be opportunities in terms of automations and new ways of doing things. There may be, you can get some tips in terms of what you do from other charities. And obviously assessing the impact of COVID-19, because I think we're all conscious now, having been through 8 months or so of COVID, that there may be significant long-term implications. So, for example, in terms of working at home, travel and other costs. And I think we've seen many charities who have successfully reduced costs over this period. Interestingly, some charities whose income streams are very secure have actually ended up in a stronger financial position as a result of COVID, because their income streams have held up well and their costs have actually gone down. In terms of some of the granular detail in terms of what you can do on cost structures, looking at your procurement review processes in terms of tendering, making sure that you've got good processes in place for approval of orders at the initial stage. It's all very well having approval processes for invoices and payments, but the commitment is made at the order stage. Looking at different ways of providing services. So many charities have been providing services through internet-based solutions in recent times. Reviewing what employees actually do, and I think the furlough scheme for many organisations has been quite an eye-opener, because they've seen and they've really had a clear idea of what people actually do. And unfortunately for the individuals involved, it may well be that the charities and others will decide that what they do is not necessarily mission critical, and make some changes. So, and obviously the scheme has recently been extended through to the end of March. So investing in technology and automation, charities sometimes lag behind the commercial sector in terms of technology because of the challenges in terms of funding for investment. But really, if you're going to progress, you know, that's a key, likely to be a key element. Reduce travel costs, looking at how meetings are held. We've seen an increasing number of charities operating through virtual offices now, with people working at home. You may have your own views on how enjoyable it is at working at home, but it's certainly one way of reducing property costs if you can make sure that you maintain the culture of your organisation. We've seen many charities reducing pension costs. The most obvious sector where that's happened is in the school sector, where many independent schools have been reducing their pension costs by coming out of the teachers' pension scheme. We're seeing more and more charities looking at bulk buying, sharing service provision, which Louise will talk on slightly later. So, for example, in the academy school sector, we deal with a lot of academies, and many of those do get together with other academies in terms of consortium and bulk buying. And then finally, in terms of cost structures, looking at the use of volunteers. If used effectively, clearly volunteers provide a valuable additional resource at no cost, assuming that you can manage them. If we move on to good financial management in terms of how you do some of these things, it's important to have a rigorous budget process and not just looking at last year's cost plus 3%. Zero-sum budgeting can be quite useful, where you actually start off with a zero figure and build your budget up from scratch, looking at everything in great detail. That can be quite a successful way of achieving savings. So, for example, in an area like printing and stationery costs, you might come to the conclusion you don't need to do any printing and stationery because everything can be done electronically. Developing a culture in your organisation where budgetary control is really important, and not just for people at the top, but throughout the organisation, can be really helpful in generating savings. Understanding what a fixed and variable costs are is important. So it's great to have, if you can, the more variable costs than fixed costs. So I mentioned earlier property costs. So property is typically a cost that is very fixed. So that is one that's quite useful if you can reduce. As an accountant, you'd expect us to say that preparing management accounts is important, doing forecasts both shorter and long term, and assessing the effectiveness of different activities and really understanding what really does give benefit. So in this area, surveys of beneficiaries can be quite useful. And in terms of managing cash flow, credit control and managing cash flow carefully, really important. Finally, from me, in terms of looking at reserves and cash flow management, reserves have been very topical in the sector for some time. The reserves are there to deal with any emergencies, and I think many charities have realised that the rainy day has come. So some charities are using their reserves to help with their financial resilience. Looking at designation of funds and perhaps revising what you plan to do with funds in the future. Restricted funds are important, and I think we have seen many charities have received money for restricted purposes and who've been unable to undertake the particular activity for which those monies were given. Have been going back to funders asking them to de-restrict funds so that they can be used for general purposes, and that has been quite successful. Charities using or building reserves. So I think charities are often got targets for reserves. I mean, in an ideal world, you might have developed reserves in the future that you can use, but if you haven't looked to build them, cash flow management links closely with reserves. Clearly you need to have sufficient cash to deal with whatever liabilities arise. Important to maintain a good relationship with your bank and make sure that you monitor these things on a regular basis. So that's enough from me. I'll now hand over to Louise to talk about mergers and collaborations. Louise.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, I can confirm I am in Hampshire, unfortunately, not somewhere warm and sunny anymore. Anyway, financial resilience requires a charity to be very agile in all aspects. It has to have the ability to assess its requirements and to move quickly to ensure it's always achieving its objectives. And these objectives need to be achieved in the best possible way, which may include considering a strategic alliance, collaboration, or a merger. So when and why would a charity want to consider these? Well, it could be as a response to austerity. It may be a needs must where the charity just can't survive without support from another entity. It could be that the independence of the charity is in question, or that there are cultural challenges being faced by the charity. If the impact on beneficiaries is going to be positive by some alliance, collaboration, or merger, then again it should be considered. Another reason could be where there's a legal issue. It could be that there's a legal aspect of the structure that needs to be reviewed, or it could be that there's situational changes in the legislation making it impossible for the charity to continue as it is. And finally, it could be that there are links with non-charities which would benefit the beneficiaries if an alliance was formed, and therefore it would be very important to consider this option at this stage. But before we look at the options the charities have, we're going to do a quick poll, another poll. If we could ask you just to complete the following: do you think your charity could benefit from a collaboration or merger? 5 possibilities: already collaborating, definitely, maybe, no, or don't know. So another quick poll just to give us some feel of where everybody is with collaborations and mergers. So another few seconds And I think we have a result, Lizzie. Maybe, interesting, and 8% no. So no one is collaborating, no one's definitely collaborating. I think the maybe is where we're seeing charities at the moment. It'd be interesting to know why there's some definite no's, but obviously it's an area, hopefully, that's going to be of interest as we work through the rest of the slides. So what are the possible combinations that you have? As we go down the list, the options become more structured. Now, this isn't a complete list, it's just a list of examples of the type of combinations that you could get into that may actually benefit your charity. So we start starting at the top, which is really just very simple sharing of information. But you've got to be very careful when you're sharing information because of things like GDPR. The next one is to affiliate with some other entity, and this normally happens where you've got common goals. So it may be that there's another charity that's doing something very similar, could be horizontal or vertical integration, but working together could give a better result. Sharing of services is something that we're beginning to see more and more. Things like payroll, it's very easy to get another entity to actually process your payroll for you. Things like HR, so shared services is another way of actually collaborating with another entity. You could act as an agent, or you could be an agency for another entity. In other words, promoting each other's causes. And joint ventures are usually created where you have a combined project with another organisation, but you have the same goal as the end target. Shared trustees is something we're seeing more and more of. If you haven't got the spread of experience and the spread of mix of trustees on your board, it may be that you can share trustees with another charity. This is going to bring huge advantages from their experience of working with another charity to your board of trustees. And finally, the merger, which is the complete joining of the two entities together, which obviously is the most complex of the possible combinations. So we're going to start by looking at collaborations, and the Charity Commission says that a collaboration is a joint working by two or more charities in order to fulfil their purpose whilst remaining as separate organisations. It may relate to any aspect of the charity's operational activity. It could be administration, as we've just said, things like wages and salaries being processed. It could be fundraising. It could be marketing, profile enhancement. The list is endless. But primarily, it has to be an exchange for mutual advantage, and the benefit has to be to the beneficiaries. So the objective of your charity, if it's going to benefit by a collaboration, then it's obviously worth considering. And the current times, COVID-19, we are seeing obviously collaborations, and I think that the working style of charities is going to change in the future. Things like office working space, we maybe don't all need our own offices, so I think that collaborations are going to be an area that we will see more charities working together on. So the advantages of collaboration, they can be very simple to set up, and they can have a low risk to the charity because there's no formal structure. The charities are all retaining their own independence, their own structures, so the risk is limited, and there tends to be a low setup cost. So it's all quite simple and straightforward, and it should result in reduced costs and hopefully building increased resilience for your charity. The combination of using someone else or collaborating with someone else should also increase awareness of your charity, and it should hopefully help the charity innovate and grow, which again, all these advantages should lead to benefits for the beneficiaries. But obviously where we've got advantages, we're always going to have disadvantages, and these disadvantages could include stakeholder confusion, not knowing who's doing what, very unclear of the divisions of responsibilities and duties. The complexity of decision making, we all know, when there's one organisation making a decision, it can be hard enough. When there's two parties to one decision, it can become very complex. And sometimes the cost to resolve these disagreements can actually exceed the benefit. So if an outcome doesn't justify the time and resource, these collaborations may not actually be beneficial. Loss of flexibility in working practices. if you're using some other entity to help do something within your organisation, you may lose the flexibility of deciding when, where, how, why it's actually undertaken. Things like dates of your payroll, you may have to tie in with what their dates are. There may be limited opportunities. There may not be other entities, charities that can actually assist in the areas that you need assistance in. So it could be a restriction by not actually finding someone who can actually collaborate with you to fulfill that need. And the other disadvantage is obviously you do need an exit strategy. Where there's no formal agreement, it can be very messy when you want to break the collaboration that has been set up. So the loss of confidence by stakeholders, if this happens, can be detrimental. So it does need to be considered. So the most structured of our examples would be the mergers. Now, mergers are where two or more separate charities come together to form one organisation. So it can be a new charity being formed, or more commonly, where one charity gains control of another charity. And at the moment, there's something like 168,000 UK charities, and the Charity Commission is actually very pro mergers and collaborations. And I think last week, the Charities Commission issued the number of mergers so far in 2020 as being 202. That's still a very, very small number compared to the number of charities that actually exist. And that's actually an increase on previous years. And that increase, I think, has come about because of the circumstances we're actually finding ourselves in at the moment. There's recently been in the news the merger of Dementia UK and Young Dementia UK. This had very, very positive press coverage because of the amplification of the two voices together. And we see social care charities merging more commonly than other charities. And there was also another merger in the press, but this was for the wrong reasons, not the right reasons. And it was Grindworks Leeds and Grindwork Wakefield. And the merger actually included a £600,000 debt to Wakefield Council. And obviously there was a question mark over the Grindwork Leeds combining with the Wakefield charity, because their property was then at risk to cover the debt of the Wakefield Council. So just be careful that mergers obviously are for the right reason and obviously not the wrong reason. So what about advantages then of your mergers? Well, if you have a merger, you're going to be bringing two entities together, and hopefully the governance of that combined entity is going to be stronger than the two individual entities. The expertise of both boards can come together to provide better governance for the new entity. Economies of scale should be achieved, various cost savings as a result of two entities becoming one. By avoiding duplication, things like you may not need two office spaces, you may be able to do one marketing campaign. All these things can obviously help with the economies of scales and be advantages of mergers. Value for money, a larger charity may have power in everything it does, so you may be able to purchase things more efficiently. You may be able to actually achieve your objectives more efficiently. So where a charity's objective is no longer relevant, sometimes the only option is either to merge or to cease. And it's obviously quite sad if a charity's worked very hard to achieve its objective and it has all that knowledge and all that experience to just end up being ceased. So if it merges with another charity, so it has an objective to fulfill, then obviously it can retain the knowledge and experience and all the contacts that it has actually created in the past. Sometimes it's just obvious for two charities to merge, like the example of Dementia UK and Young Dementia. It's a natural link of two organisations that will work better as one and hopefully provide its beneficiaries with a greater end result. And growth, when you've got two charities that combine, you immediately have a bigger entity. And as we refer to the snowball effect, once you start rolling that bigger entity, it's much easier sometimes to grow en masse when you have one large entity compared to two smaller entities. And finally, survival. Sometimes there is no choice. Mergers, unfortunately, do often occur where one charity is not going to survive unless it merges with another charity. And that sometimes can lead to a takeover rather than technically a merger. And again, we've got some disadvantages of mergers in the same way as we had with collaborations, and the fact that it can lead to a loss of control. Often the larger charity will take over rather than there being a merger and an equalisation of control between the two charities that are merging. Competition between partners, different people can be competing for a same limited resource. So old habits die hard. You need to have a harmonious board of trustees. You need to be harmonious in everything that you're doing. It can actually lead to a lack of resource when you actually merge two entities. You can have one people trying to do something for two different entities that are now one. So you need to be careful to make sure that the resource is equal to the new entity that's being created. Insufficient experience or information can harm your charity. So make sure that when this merger does happen, if it's going to happen, everybody is aware of what's happening, why it's happening, when it's happening, and how it's happening. Clashing personalities is one of the main reasons that mergers are quite rare. We have often heard about charities that would like to merge, but when it actually comes to it, the boards cannot agree on an approach to take this forward, and it doesn't happen. So ensure that if you are going to have a merger, that your personalities are engaged so that we don't have a clashing to actually damage the charities in their new entity. And finally, the disadvantage could be a cultural mismatch. Diseconomies of scale can arise where this actually happens. So make sure that you're aware of advantages and disadvantages. So what should you think about when you're considering a merger to try and obviously avoid the disadvantages and maximise the advantages? First of all, you need to obviously set your objective. Why do you want to collaborate or merge? You need the objective to be visible, clear and understood by all parties. You need to obviously consider resistance to change internally and externally. The people within the charities may not want to merge, and obviously externally the stakeholders need to be on board with any merger. You need to consider any cultural mismatch and again address this. It may not be a deterrent in the long run, but you do need to address it and make sure it is managed in the appropriate way if you're going to continue with such a merger. Lack of clarity over roles and responsibilities. Again, people don't like change, so you need to make sure that everyone is aware from the outset to avoid misunderstandings. Personalities, as I said, we've already covered that. The main reason for mergers not happening, the personalities use people's strengths, not their weaknesses. Make sure you tap into what they're good at rather than highlighting what they're not good at. Definitely get a written agreement. You will need a legal agreement document drawn up, and make sure that this is agreed before you progress down this path too far. You'll need lawyers, it can be expensive, and both parties need to be in agreement. And there must be agreed mutual benefits to any collaboration or merger. If it's not a bigger picture by combining your two entities, then what's the point? You have to be gaining something from this merger. And you need to make sure that your ICT tools are sufficient for the new entity. If your computer systems are not going to be able to cope, you've obviously got to consider that. And you need to consider whose systems, whose controls, whose procedures are you going to use. You won't be able to use both entities, both charities, systems, controls and procedures. Somewhere there's a compromise in doing this. And obviously consider due diligence. Make sure you know what you're taking on board if you're merging with another charity. So my top tips on how to have a successful merger are fairly simple. Forward planning. Ensure you set your joint combined new objective. Make sure it is achievable and achievable. Identify your risks and your rewards. I said your risks should be reduced, your rewards should be increased. Consider the cultural fit. You need to make sure that this is going to work with the people, with the culture of the charities, with the stakeholders. It all has to fit together. Don't underestimate the cost of a merger. There will be costs involved, and these need to be set out at the start. You need a strategy for alignment between the two charities. They will be separate entities. They do need to come together. They do need to match up. So make sure there is a strategy to get this aligned. Engagement of your leadership teams. This, I think, is one of the strongest points, is the engagement of your leadership team. It is critical that the people in both charities are on board. They need to be working together to make this happen. And think about the future, not just the short term. A merger is a permanent fix. It's not a short-term fix. You're not going to be able to unravel it very easily. So you do need to think about the long term as well as the short. So thank you very much. That's my section on collaborations and mergers. I believe we now have time for any questions, if anyone has anything.
So Lizzie, are there any questions?
Sorry, thank you, Mike. Yes, we have 2 questions today, and the first one is, what are the major obstacles to a merger?
Louise, did you want to take that one? I think you know what you're going to say.
Yes, well, the major obstacles are the people, to be quite honest. I mean, once you've found a charity that fits with you, and if everything looks like it should happen, the major obstacle tends to be the people within the charities. They have to want to make it work together. As I said, the reality is that often mergers happen where one of the charities is the weaker party. It isn't always an equal merger, but where it is an equal merger, it's the personalities, I think, which will be the biggest challenge.
Okay, thank you, Louise. Lizzie, did you say there was another question?
Yes, Mike, there was one last question for today, and that was, how do we benchmark?
Okay, so that's a good question. I think it partly depends on what sector you're in. In some sectors, there is some quite good benchmarking data available. So, for example, in the academy sector, we produce a very useful benchmarking report. If you're an independent school, there is a national survey there. It's also quite useful. You compare yourself with similar schools. And whilst benchmarking doesn't always give the answer, often gives you some thought as to why your results may be different to others. And then I think it's helpful to say that you can do your own benchmarking as well. So if you're in a sector where there's lots of charities of a similar type, even from published information, you can get data. And so, for example, I'm a trustee, I mentioned about Oxfordshire Mind earlier. We're looking at doing different things. So we have done some comparisons between ourselves and other mind organisations around the country, looking at some key things. Also, as well as just looking at the ball data, it's also people in the charity sector are usually quite happy if you're not really competing directly with them to share information on RDs, etc. So once you've got some basic data, it can be really useful. You can find some similar organisations that you respect and admire and speak to them about how they do things, and that can be a really useful way of benchmarking, which may give you all sorts of useful ideas and could help you generate new income sources, or could help you on the cost side and different ways of doing things. So if there are no further questions, I'd like to thank Lizzie for dealing with all the technology, and I'd like to thank Louise too, of course, for contributing, and I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'm sad to say that the sun is no longer shining in Hungerford, but I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.